She cleaned the company's spaces as if sweeping away her own pain. He, a lonely millionaire, never knew how to deal with what he couldn't control. But when he saw her smile at another man, something dark ignited. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment saying where you're listening from. Let's continue. The mirrored elevator reflected Carter Foster Whitman in multiple versions, all impeccable, all empty. At 41, he had perfected the art of existing without feeling. Each calculated movement, each measured word, each practiced expression designed to convey exactly what he intended and nothing more. The 32nd floor of Whitman Developments was his kingdom of glass and steel, where numbers danced in spreadsheets and contracts multiplied like cancer cells, feeding an empire that grew to fill the void he carried in his chest. Chicago seethed below, a pulsating mass of dreams and desperation that he observed from the panoramic window of his office. But to Carter, the city was merely a game board where he moved his pieces with surgical precision. He had learned early that feelings were dangerous luxuries, capable of destroying everything built with blood and sweat. The lesson had been etched into his soul at 15, when he found his mother, Claire Whitman, floating in the pool of their country house, her arms spread as if trying to embrace death itself. The official report spoke of an accident. His family spoke of tragedy, but Carter knew the truth. His mother had chosen to die because loving too much had broken her in half. The tears he shed for her were the last he allowed himself. Since then, he had built a wall around his heart, brick by brick, rejection by rejection, until nothing could touch him anymore, except for her. Eve Norton cleaned the meeting rooms as if erasing footprints in the sand. Silent, almost invisible, she moved through the company corridors like a shadow that no one noticed. At 24, she carried a subtle beauty that hid beneath loose uniforms and perpetually tied-back hair. But it was her eyes that intrigued Carter, deep brown, seeming to harbor ancient secrets and unhealed wounds. She had arrived at the company 3 months ago, through a cleaning service contractor. She didn't talk much, didn't smile at anyone, didn't participate in hallway conversations. She did her job with almost obsessive perfection and disappeared like smoke when finished. To other employees, Eve was just another cog in the corporate machine. To Carter, she had become a silent obsession. He began to notice her by chance, one afternoon when he was working late and saw her wiping down the tables in the meeting room. There was something about the way she moved, cautious, always alert to sounds around her, like a wild animal ready to flee at the slightest sign of danger. That awakened an irritating curiosity in him. He was accustomed to being noticed, desired, feared. Women melted with a glance from him, men competed for his approval, but Eve treated him as if he were part of the furniture. And that infuriated him. He began creating pretexts to pass near her. He would drop a pen, forget a document on the table, invent unnecessary meetings just to see her work. Eve always moved away when he approached, maintaining a respectful and professional distance that deeply irritated him. There was no submission in her gestures, no admiration, no fear. Only a courteous indifference that made him feel small. One night, pretending to work late, he waited for her to arrive for the evening cleaning. He was alone in the office when Eve entered, pushing her cart of supplies. She greeted him with a nod and began to work, completely ignoring his presence. Carter observed her for long minutes, hypnotized by the economical grace of her movements. "Are you afraid of me?" he suddenly asked, breaking the silence. Eve stopped what she was doing and looked at him directly for the first time. Their eyes met for a few seconds that seemed eternal. There was something there, a spark, an electrical connection that traveled through the air between them like an invisible lightning bolt. "No, sir," she answered in a low, firm voice. "I'm just doing my job." The simplicity of the response disarmed him. He had expected nervousness, stuttering, perhaps a blush on her cheeks. But Eve looked at him with a serenity that bordered on insolence. There was strength in that apparent fragility, a dignity that both intrigued and challenged him. "What's your name?" he asked, although he already knew the answer. He had memorized her full name, her address, her history. "Eve," she replied, returning to her work. "Eve," he repeated, savoring the syllables. A beautiful name, biblical. She didn't respond, but he saw her shoulders tense slightly. He continued to observe her work, lost in thoughts he couldn't organize. There was something about Eve that awakened sensations long dormant in him. It wasn't just physical desire. It was something deeper, more dangerous. A need he couldn't name or control. When she finished and prepared to leave, Carter felt an inexplicable impulse to stop her. He wanted to talk more, know more about her, understand what was behind those enigmatic eyes. But Eve had already left, leaving only the subtle aroma of her perfume in the air and a restlessness that would accompany him throughout the night. Eve woke with her heart racing, as always happened when she dreamed of the past. In her dreams, she was still a 7-year-old child hidden in the closet, hearing her mother's screams and the heavy footsteps of the man who had promised to take care of them. It took a few seconds to recognize the small apartment in Wicker Park that she shared with 2 roommates, far from the ghosts that haunted her in the early hours. She got up slowly, feeling the familiar weight of loneliness she carried like a second skin. At 24, she had learned to live in invisibility, not to create bonds, not to arouse interest. It was safer that way. People who stood out got hurt. People who loved were abandoned. Her mother had died loving the wrong man, and Eve had grown up promising herself she would never repeat that mistake. The lukewarm shower helped her chase away the vestiges of the nightmare. She put on the navy blue uniform of the cleaning company, tied her brown hair in a simple bun, and looked at herself in the mirror. There she saw the reflection of a woman who had chosen to be a ghost, present but imperceptible, useful but dispensable. That was how she survived. The journey to Whitman Developments took an hour and a half by public transportation. Eve used the time to read used books she bought at second-hand stores around the city. Classic literature mainly. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Toni Morrison. Words that transported her to worlds where pain had meaning and love wasn't synonymous with destruction. She arrived at the corporate building when the sun was still struggling against Chicago's morning mist. The security guards greeted her with mechanical nods. Just another anonymous face in the crowd of outsourced employees who kept that machine running. Eve took the service elevators, avoiding the mirrored ones where executives admired themselves while planning their conquests. The 32nd floor was Carter Foster Whitman's territory. Eve had cleaned dozens of executive offices, but never found an environment as impersonal as his. There were no family photographs, personal objects, or any trace of humanity. Just expensive designer furniture, abstract artwork, and a panoramic view that seemed more like a showcase than a window to the world. She had noticed his interest, of course. She wasn't blind or naive. She saw how he invented excuses to walk down the corridors when she was working, how his eyes followed her when he thought she wasn't looking. Powerful men always had fantasies about vulnerable women. It was a cliché as old as the world, but there was something different about Carter. When he looked at her, she saw a hunger that went beyond physical desire. It was as if he wanted to devour her completely, possess her not only in body, but in soul. And that frightened her in a way she couldn't explain. She began cleaning the main meeting room, moving with the silent efficiency she had perfected over the years. Each gesture was calculated to make no noise, draw no attention, not disturb the corporate environment that functioned around her like a well-rehearsed orchestra. That was when she heard voices coming from Carter's office. The door was ajar, and the words reached her in fragments. "There's problem with the Southside development," said a male voice she recognized as belonging to the company's vice president. "The residents are organizing, trying to prevent the demolition." "Then solve it," replied Carter, with the coldness that characterized him. "Offer larger settlements. If they refuse, find other ways to persuade them. And if that doesn't work..." There was a pause. Eve pretended to be concentrated on cleaning, but all her senses were heightened. "It always works," Carter finally said. "Everyone has a price, and everyone has something to lose." The words chilled Eve's blood. She knew that tone, that cruel certainty of someone accustomed to getting what they wanted at any cost. It was the same tone her stepfather used when he wanted to break her mother's resistance. She finished her work quickly and left the room, but the words echoed in her mind. Carter Foster Whitman was everything she had learned to fear in men: power without limits, ambition without scruples, the ability to destroy lives as if moving pieces on a game board. So why, when he appeared in the hallway and their eyes met, did she feel that same electric spark traveling through the air between them? "Eve," he said, and the sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. "Mr. Whitman," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Are you all right? You seem tense." The question surprised her. She hadn't expected him to notice, much less care. For a moment, she saw something different in his eyes, a genuine concern that contrasted with the hardness she had witnessed minutes before. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired." Carter took a step closer, and Eve had to force herself not to back away. He smelled of expensive cologne and masculine power, a toxic combination that made her body react in ways her mind rejected. "You work too hard," he said, and there was something almost tender in his voice. "A woman like you should—" "A woman like me," interrupted Eve, and for the first time since they'd met there was defiance in her voice. Carter seemed surprised by the interruption. He was accustomed to commanding conversations, to having his words received as absolute truths. But Eve was looking at him with an intensity that disarmed him. "I'm sorry," he said, and Eve realized that he rarely apologized for anything. "I didn't mean to sound condescending." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But there was something in the way he had backed down, as if he genuinely cared what she thought, that left her confused. Men like Carter didn't apologize to women like her, not unless they wanted something in return. "I need to continue working," she said, taking a step back. "Of course," replied Carter, but he didn't move to let her pass. "Eve, I would like to talk with you. Another time, perhaps." The proposal hung in the air between them, like both a promise and a threat. Eve knew she should refuse, that she should maintain the safe distance she had built around herself, but there was something in his eyes that intrigued her, a vulnerability carefully hidden behind the mask of power. Nathan had the most genuine smile Eve had ever seen. At 26, he carried a contagious joy that seemed to challenge all the world's sorrows. He worked as a delivery person for a chain of Japanese restaurants, and whenever he appeared at Whitman Developments, he brought with him a luminous energy that contrasted with the cold, calculating environment of the company. Eve had met him in the reception area 3 weeks ago, when he was delivering lunch for some executive. He had commented on the book she was reading, The Great Gatsby, and initiated a conversation about Fitzgerald that extended for several minutes. He was educated, funny, and had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen, not merely observed. "You have the saddest eyes I've ever seen," he had said in that first encounter, "but also the most beautiful." Eve had blushed, not accustomed to receiving compliments. Nathan wasn't handsome in the conventional sense. He had soft features, thick-framed glasses, and an awkward way of moving. But there was a genuine kindness in him that touched her in an unexpected way. They began meeting casually. Nathan made a point of accepting deliveries to the Whitman building and always found time to chat with Eve. They talked about books, about the city, about small and big dreams. He told her that he studied history at night at a public university, that he wanted to be a teacher, that he believed in the transformative power of education. Eve gradually allowed herself to open some cracks in her emotional armor. She told him about her passion for literature, about her dream of one day having her own library, about the loneliness she carried as a constant companion. Nathan listened to her with an attention she had never experienced before. "You're special, Eve," he would say. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." There was something prophetic in those words, though she didn't yet know it. It was on a Thursday that Nathan invited her out. They were in the reception area, talking about a movie that had been on television the night before when he said with adorable nervousness, "Eve, I know this might be crazy, but would you like to have dinner with me on Saturday? I know a simple place, but the food is good and—" "Yes," she interrupted, surprising herself with the quickness of her response. The smile that lit up Nathan's face was worth any risk that yes might represent. What Eve didn't know was that Carter had witnessed the entire scene. He was heading down for a meeting when he saw the two of them talking in the reception. He stopped on the mezzanine, hidden behind a marble column, and observed the interaction with jealousy that grew by the second. He saw how Eve's eyes shone when she talked with that ordinary man. He saw the smile she had never directed at him. He saw the naturalness, the spontaneity, the humanity she showed when not under his predatory gaze. And it enraged him in a way he couldn't control. Nathan was everything Carter despised. Mediocre, naive, satisfied with a small life without ambitions. How dare he touch with his ordinariness something that Carter considered his by right? How dare he make Eve smile when he himself, with all his power and influence, couldn't extract from her more than cautious glances? That night, Carter couldn't sleep. He paced around his penthouse apartment in Lincoln Park, a caged beast consumed by an obsession that grew like a cancer. He had everything money could buy, but he couldn't buy what he desired most, Eve Norton's genuine attention. He began investigating Nathan. He hired a private detective, discovered his routine, his family, his dreams. He learned of the degenerative condition that Nathan carefully concealed, a muscular disease that progressed slowly, but inexorably. Nathan knew he had little time to live fully, which was why he embraced each moment with an intensity that Carter both envied and despised. On Saturday, Eve got ready with a care she hadn't taken in years. She chose a simple but pretty dress, let down the hair she always kept tied back, applied a soft lipstick. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman she had forgotten existed. Young, beautiful, alive. The date with Nathan was everything she had dreamed of and feared. He took her to a small, cozy Italian restaurant in Wicker Park, where food was served on mismatched plates, and wine came in ordinary glasses. But there was magic in that simplicity. They talked for hours. Nathan told her about his childhood in rural Ohio, about his schoolteacher mother who had taught him to love books, about his factory worker father who had worked his entire life to pay for his education. Eve, for the first time, talked about her loneliness, about the years in foster homes, about the constant fear of being abandoned. "You'll never be alone again," said Nathan, holding her hand across the table. "Not while I'm here." It was a sweet and naive promise, but Eve wanted to believe it. She allowed herself to imagine a different life, simple perhaps, but filled with genuine affection. When he walked her home and said goodbye with a chaste kiss on her forehead, Eve felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. But on Monday, when she arrived at work, she found an envelope in her locker. Inside, a short, devastating note. "Terminated. Human Resources has already been informed." There was no explanation, no justification. Just a sudden emptiness where before there had been the security of a job, however humble it might be. Eve sought out the supervisor of the cleaning company, who merely shrugged with embarrassment. "I don't know what happened, honey. The order came from above. They said your services were no longer needed." "But why? Did I do something wrong?" "On the contrary, your work was always impeccable." But when the powerful decide something, the phrase hung in the air, laden with a resignation that Eve knew well. That was how the world worked for people like her, at the mercy of the whims of the powerful, disposable like defective parts in a machine that never stopped. She left the building with her few belongings in a plastic bag, feeling smaller than ever. On the street, Chicago's movement continued indifferent to her despair. Millions of people pursuing their dreams and nightmares, while hers collapsed once more. She couldn't help looking up at the 32nd floor, where Carter Foster Whitman reigned in his empire of glass and steel. She was certain that he was there, observing her humiliation with the cold satisfaction of someone moving pawns on a chessboard. But what Eve didn't know was that, at that moment, Carter was discovering that victory tasted like ashes in his mouth. Eve's silence was more deafening than any scream could have been. Carter had expected tears, pleas, perhaps a desperate confrontation. But she simply disappeared, like smoke dissipated by the wind, leaving only an emptiness he hadn't anticipated. In the first weeks after her dismissal, Carter convinced himself that he had done the right thing. Eve was a dangerous distraction, a weakness he couldn't afford. Better to cut her from his life before she caused greater damage. But the nights became too long, and the office seemed haunted by her absence. He began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. How the new cleaner left marks on the glass table, how the papers weren't organized in the precise way Eve used to do, how the environment had lost an indefinable quality that only her presence brought. So, he began to follow her tracks. He discovered that Eve had found a job at a community clinic in Pilsen, working as a receptionist. For an entire week, Carter drove past the place, observing her through the windows. She seemed smaller in that environment, more fragile, but maintained the same dignified posture that had fascinated him from the beginning. The anger returned to consume him when he saw Nathan picking her up after work. The young man brought flowers, simple daisies bought at a corner stand, and the smile that lit up Eve's face when she saw him was like a stab in Carter's chest. They walked down the street hand in hand, talking animatedly, oblivious to the world around them. Eve laughed at something Nathan had said, a crystalline sound that Carter had never heard before. That was how she could be, light, happy, free, away from him. That night, Carter made a call. "Dr. Martinez," he said when the clinic director answered. "Carter Whitman. I know our company has some investments in public health projects." The conversation lasted just a few minutes. Carter didn't need to be explicit. Men like Dr. Martinez understood the subtle language of power. When he hung up the phone, he knew that Eve would be unemployed again within a week, and that's exactly what happened. Eve received the news on a Friday, with the same lack of explanation as the previous time. Budget cuts was the vague justification she received. Once again, she collected her things in a plastic bag and went out into the streets of Chicago in search of a new opportunity. But this time, Nathan was by her side. "This isn't a coincidence," he said, sitting on the sofa in Eve's small apartment. "2 dismissals without explanation in places where you were praised for your work. Someone is sabotaging you." Eve wanted to disagree, but deep down she knew he was right. There was an invisible hand manipulating her life, closing doors, cutting off opportunities, and she suspected who it was. "It's him, isn't it?" asked Nathan, and Eve didn't need to ask who he was talking about. "I don't know," she lied, but Nathan knew her gestures too well to believe the denial. "That man in the building, the one who looked at you like you were his property." The description was so accurate that Eve felt a shiver. Nathan had noticed things she thought she had successfully hidden. "He's dangerous, Eve. Men like him think they can buy anything, including people." "And what do you want me to do?" she finally exploded. "Confront him? Prove something?" "I have no power against him. I'm nobody." Nathan moved closer and held her face between his hands, forcing her to look him in the eyes. "You are not nobody," he said with an intensity that surprised her. "You are Eve Norton. You survived a terrible childhood, raised yourself, built a life with your own hands. You are stronger than any rich, spoiled man." He kissed her then, for the first time since they had met. It was a gentle kiss, full of promises and hopes. Eve allowed herself to sink into that sensation, that illusion that she could have a normal life with a good man. But reality came knocking again when Eve got a new job, this time as a saleswoman in a clothing store downtown. For 2 weeks everything went well. She began to believe that perhaps Carter had finally lost interest, that she could rebuild her life away from his toxic influence, until the store was forced to close due to documentation problems. "Irregularities in permits," explained the owner with tears in her eyes. "Inspectors showed up from every possible agency. I've never seen anything like it." Eve knew it wasn't a coincidence. Carter was playing with her like a cat plays with an injured mouse, allowing small hopes before delivering the next blow. The 3rd dismissal was followed by a 4th, then a 5th. Each time Eve managed to get back on her feet, a new catastrophe knocked her down. The explanations varied: staff cuts, financial problems, organizational restructuring, but the pattern was always the same. Nathan began investigating on his own. He used his contacts at the university, researched Whitman developments, mapped Carter's connections with different sectors of Chicago's economy. What he discovered shocked him. Carter's influence extended far beyond real estate. He had fingers in companies across various segments, investments in media outlets, relationships with politicians and businessmen who controlled the city's economic life. "He can do this forever," said Nathan one night, showing Eve a complex network of connections he had drawn on paper. "He has enough power to keep you unemployed for the rest of your life." It was a terrible truth, but Eve refused to accept defeat. "So what do you suggest?" she asked, though she feared the answer. Nathan hesitated before speaking. His condition was worsening. Eve had noticed the small tremors in his hands, the fatigue he tried to hide. Time was running out for both of them, each in their own way. "Maybe it's time to confront him directly," he finally said. "Not at the company where he has all the advantages, but in a public place, where he can't simply ignore you or have you thrown out." "And then?" "Then you find out what he really wants, and decide if it's worth paying the price." The suggestion hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Both knew that once Eve put herself directly on Carter's radar, there would be no turning back. It would be like willingly entering the wolf's den. But Eve was tired of running, tired of having her life controlled by a man she didn't even know properly. If she was going to be destroyed, at least it would be while fighting. "All right," she said, surprising even herself with the firmness of the decision. "Let's do this." Nathan smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes, as if he knew that this conversation marked the beginning of the end of something precious they had built together. Chicago's rain fell with the typical violence of summer afternoons, transforming streets into turbulent rivers that swept away the dreams and nightmares of 8 million people. Carter watched the storm from his office window, but his mind was far from meteorological concerns. It had been 3 months since Eve had been fired from her last job, and her silence was becoming unbearable. He had imagined that she would seek him out, that she would come to his door desperate, willing to negotiate anything in exchange for an opportunity. He had planned the encounter dozens of times in his mind, he magnanimous, she submissive, an agreement that would benefit both. But Eve remained invisible, living in the shadows of the city like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. The frustration had transformed into something darker. Carter began to dream about her, disturbing dreams where Eve appeared sometimes as victim, sometimes as executioner. He would wake up sweating, heart racing, feeling a need that he couldn't satisfy with the women who passed through his bed with the frequency of train stations. It was on one of these troubled mornings that his assistant brought an envelope with no return address. Inside, a simple sheet of paper with a handwritten message in feminine handwriting. "A linear restaurant, today at 8 p.m. Come alone. E." Carter read and reread the message, looking for hidden meanings in the economical words. It was a trap, obviously, but a trap he was eager to fall into. He arrived at the restaurant 15 minutes before the appointed time, chose a strategic table where he could observe the entire entrance. Alinea was neutral territory, too elegant for public scandals, but not so exclusive that Eve would feel completely out of place. When she appeared, Carter felt the air leave his lungs. Eve had transformed. Her brown hair, previously always tied back, fell in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore a simple but elegant black dress that accentuated her discreet curves without being vulgar. There was subtle makeup that highlighted her brown eyes, now carrying a determination he had never seen before. She approached the table with firm steps, ignoring the curious glances from other diners. When she sat down across from him, Carter realized that she was no longer the fragile and cautious woman he had known. There was a new strength there, forged by adversity and tempered by anger. "Eve," he said, trying to keep his voice controlled. "You look beautiful." "Spare me the pleasantries," she replied, her voice sharp as glass. "We both know why we're here." Carter felt an involuntary smile form on his lips. He liked this new version of Eve, challenging, direct, dangerous. "Do we really?" he asked, leaning slightly forward. "Why don't you clarify for me?" Eve looked at him with an intensity that made something move in his chest. There was fire in those eyes, a passion that transcended anger and touched on something more primitive. "You destroyed my life," she said, without beating around the bush. "Systematically, deliberately. I want to know why. I think you already know the answer. I want to hear it from you." Carter took a sip of the wine he had ordered while waiting, savoring the moment. He had dreamed of this conversation, but reality surpassed his fantasies. Eve was there finally, all her attention focused on him. "Because you fascinate me," he finally said. "From the first day I saw you, I couldn't get you out of my head. And when I saw you with that guy, Nathan, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Jealousy, desire, possessiveness." Eve laughed, but it was a bitter sound without joy. "So you decided to torture me until I came running into your arms. I decided to remove the obstacles between us." "The obstacles?" Eve's voice rose a tone, attracting some glances. She breathed deeply, regaining control. "You mean my dignity, my independence? My ability to choose?" Carter felt a pang of what might be guilt, but quickly pushed it away. Men in his position didn't have the luxury of regret. "You're here," he said simply. "That's what matters." "I'm here because I have no more choices," replied Eve. "You made sure of that." They stared at each other in silence for long seconds. The restaurant continued to function around them, waiters serving elaborate dishes, couples talking about trivialities, executives closing deals. But for Carter and Eve, the world had reduced to that table, that moment, that electric tension that had always existed between them. "What do you want from me?" Eve finally asked. It was the question Carter had asked himself 1,000 times, but had never been able to completely answer. What he wanted from Eve transcended the physical, the emotional, even the psychological. It was something deeper, more primordial. "I want you," he said, and for the first time in years he was completely honest. "All of you. Your body, your mind, your soul. I want to possess you in every possible way." Eve studied him with eyes that seemed capable of seeing through his emotional armor. "And in return?" "In return, you'll never have to worry about money, about work, about security. I'll take care of you like no one ever has, as your property, as my woman." The distinction was subtle but important, and both understood it. Eve leaned back in her chair, processing the proposal that wasn't really a surprise. "And if I say no?" Carter smiled, but there was no warmth in that expression. "You won't say no." "So certain." "Eve, you're intelligent. You know you have no alternatives. I can keep you unemployed indefinitely. I can make your life impossible in ways you can't even imagine. Or you can accept what I'm offering and have a life most women only dream of." It was pure blackmail, dressed in elegant words and served in one of the most expensive restaurants in the city. Eve knew this, and Carter knew that she knew. "You're a monster," she said. But there was something in her voice that wasn't just repulsion. "I'm a man who knows what he wants and has the means to get it. And Nathan." The mention of the name was like a slap in Carter's face. He had almost forgotten about his rival, so focused was he on the conquest of Eve. "What about him?" "He loves me. For real. No conditions, no power games." "And do you love him?" It was a dangerous question, and Eve hesitated before answering. She liked Nathan, respected him, felt safe with him. But love was what she felt when she looked at Carter, that toxic mixture of desire and fear, attraction and repulsion that consumed her from inside like acid. "That doesn't matter," she finally said. "It matters to me." "Why?" Carter leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Because I want to be the only man you desire. And I know you desire me, Eve. I can see it in your eyes, in the way your body reacts when I'm close. You may hate me, you may fear me, but you also desire me." It was true, and Eve hated the fact that he could read her so easily. There was indeed a magnetic attraction between them, a chemistry that defied logic and morality. But to acknowledge this would be to surrender completely. "I need time to think," she said, rising from the table. Carter also stood, gently holding her arm. "Don't take too long," he whispered. "Patience has never been my virtue." Eve arrived home with her heart in tatters and her mind in turmoil. The apartment she shared with 2 roommates was empty, wrapped in the silence that always precedes great storms. She sat on the narrow bed where she had spent so many nights dreaming of a different life, and tried to process what had just happened. Carter's proposal echoed in her ears like a disturbing melody. He hadn't lied about anything. He really could keep her life destroyed indefinitely, and he really could offer her luxuries she could never imagine. But at what price? Her soul, her dignity, her ability to look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgust. The phone rang, interrupting her tortured thoughts. It was Nathan. "How did it go?" he asked, and Eve realized from his voice that he already knew the answer. "Complicated," she replied, unable to find more precise words. "Did he make the proposal we expected?" Eve closed her eyes, remembering Carter's predatory look, the way he had talked about possessing her completely. "Yes," she whispered. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Nathan spoke again, his voice was laden with a sadness that broke Eve's heart. "And you're considering accepting?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Nathan knew her too well not to notice her hesitation. "Nathan, You don't need to explain," he interrupted. "I understand, I really do understand." "No, you don't understand," Eve exploded, getting up from the bed and starting to pace around the small room. "You don't understand that every fiber of my being screams to accept, even knowing it's wrong. You don't understand that when I look at him, I feel things I've never felt before, not even—" She stopped abruptly, realizing she was about to hurt the man who loved her most in the world. "Not even with me," Nathan completed, with a serenity that surprised her. "Nathan, I didn't want to—" "Eve, do you think I didn't notice? Do you think I didn't see how your eyes changed when you talked about him? How there was an intensity there that you never directed at me?" The words were spoken without bitterness, just with a melancholic acceptance that made Eve's eyes fill with tears. "You deserve someone who loves you completely," she said, her voice breaking, "and you deserve to be happy. Even if that happiness comes from a source I wish was different." Eve let herself fall to the floor, leaning against the wall as tears ran freely down her face. How had she reached this point? How had her life become a labyrinth with no exit, where all choices led to pain? "There's something I need to tell you," said Nathan, and there was a new urgency in his voice. "About my condition. About the time I have left." Eve's blood froze. She knew Nathan was sick, but he had always minimized the seriousness of the situation. "The doctors said I have maybe a year," he continued. "2, if I'm lucky. The disease is progressing faster than they expected." Eve felt the world collapse around her. It wasn't possible. She couldn't lose the only person who really cared about her, not when she had just discovered what it was like to have someone special in her life. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked between sobs. "Because I wanted our time together to be about love, not about pity. Because I wanted to protect you from this pain as long as possible." "You're an idiot," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "A wonderful, generous idiot." "Eve, I need you to listen to me. I need you to understand something important." She composed herself enough to pay attention. "That man Carter Whitman, there's something wrong with him beyond the obvious obsession with you. I investigated his family, his history. His mother committed suicide when he was 15, and there are rumors about the circumstances." Eve frowned, trying to understand where Nathan was going. "What kind of rumors?" "They say she discovered her husband's infidelity, that his lover was a household employee. She, a young woman of humble origin, who worked in the country house where Claire Whitman died." Eve's heart began to beat faster. There was something familiar in that story, something that touched on memories buried long ago. "Did you manage to discover the woman's name?" "I did. Her name was Lucy Norton." The world stopped. Eve felt as if she had been punched in the stomach, all breath escaping from her lungs at once. "Norton," she repeated, her voice hoarse. "Yes. And Eve, she had a small daughter, a girl who was taken to a foster home after her mother's death, after the scandal." The pieces began to fit together in Eve's mind like fragments of a nightmare. The vague memories of childhood, the sudden change in life when she was 5, the whispers of adults who thought she didn't understand. "My mother," she whispered. "Your mother was the lover of Carter Whitman's father. Claire Whitman killed herself because of the affair between them, and now Carter is obsessed with you." The cruel irony of the situation hit Eve with full force. Carter was trying to possess the daughter of the woman who had destroyed his mother. It was a sick repetition of the sins of the past, a cycle of obsession and destruction that perpetuated itself through the generations. "Does he know?" she asked. "I don't know, but I suspect that unconsciously there's something in him that recognizes the connection. It's the only explanation for the intensity of his obsession with you." Eve felt nauseated. It all made sense now. The magnetic attraction she felt for Carter, the sensation that they knew each other from before, the way he looked at her as if she were simultaneously his salvation and his downfall. "What do I do, Nathan? How can I accept his proposal knowing this?" "Maybe," said Nathan slowly, "that's exactly the reason why you should accept." "What do you mean?" "Eve, you have the power to break this cycle, to transform this sick obsession into something different. Your father and his mother caused destruction and death. You two can choose a different path." It was a frightening and fascinating idea at the same time. Eve had the power to redeem the past, to transform a story of tragedy into something new. "But what about you?" she asked. "How can I abandon you when you need me most?" Nathan's voice filled with infinite tenderness when he answered, "Eve, my love, I am going to die. It's a fact we can't change. But you will live, and I want you to live fully, to be happy, to experience everything life has to offer, even if it's with a man I'd like to hate but can't." "Nathan, go to him, Eve. Not out of submission, not out of desperation, but as the strong woman you are. Go and transform him into the man he can be. Break the chains of the past and build a different future." When she hung up the phone, Eve knew what she had to do. It wouldn't be easy, and it certainly wouldn't be safe. But for the first time in her life, she had the chance to control her own destiny, to transform pain into power. She picked up the phone again and dialed a number she had memorized, even without wanting to. "Carter," she said when he answered. "I accept your proposal, but with conditions." From the other end of the line, she could feel his triumphant smile through the words. "I'm listening." The apartment that Carter provided for Eve was in the Gold Coast, in one of Chicago's most upscale neighborhoods. It was an impeccable place, decorated with refined taste and expensive furniture, but that radiated the same calculated coldness as its new protector. Eve walked through the spacious rooms, feeling like a doll in a dollhouse, everything too beautiful to be real, everything too perfect to be hers. The conditions she had imposed on Carter were simple but firm. She would work as his personal assistant, with a dignified salary and real functions. She would not be kept as a decorative object or a hidden mistress. She would have financial independence and freedom to leave when she wanted, and mainly, he would respect her physical boundaries until she decided otherwise. Carter had agreed to everything, but Eve saw in his eyes the patience of a predator who knew that the prey would eventually surrender of its own accord. The first day of work was as tense as a razor's edge. Eve arrived at Whitman Developments, wearing a discreet but elegant suit that Carter had specially made for her. She felt the curious glances of the employees. Some recognized her from the time she worked in cleaning. Others merely speculated about who was the president's new personal assistant. Carter received her in his office with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was a predatory energy in him that made her feel like a rabbit in the wolf's den. But Eve forced herself to maintain a professional posture. "Welcome to your new world," he said, gesturing to the desk that had been prepared for her in a corner of the spacious office. Eve sat in the soft leather chair and tried to ignore how Carter observed her every movement. He had fulfilled his part of the agreement. She had a real job, with genuine responsibilities. But the sexual tension that hung in the air between them was almost palpable. During the first weeks, they established a strange but functional routine. Eve organized Carter's schedule, answered his calls, prepared reports, and participated in meetings. She was efficient and professional, but maintained a careful distance that he respected, with a discipline she hadn't expected from him. But the nights were different. Carter began inviting her to dinners, always with the excuse of discussing work. They went to elegant restaurants where he proved to be an intelligent and cultured companion. They talked about books, art, politics, discovering an intellectual compatibility that surprised them both. Eve began to see facets of Carter she didn't know. There was a deep loneliness in him, a thirst for genuine connection that all his power and money couldn't satisfy. When he talked about architecture, his true passion behind the real estate business, his eyes lit up with an almost childlike passion. "You should have been an architect," Eve said on one of these nights, after he spent an hour describing details of a project he had seen in Barcelona. "My father thought it was a waste of time," replied Carter, with a bitterness he rarely let escape. He said serious businessmen didn't get lost in artistic daydreams. "And you agreed with him?" Carter looked at her with an intensity that made something stir in her chest. "I agreed, because it was easier than disappointing him. Easier than fighting for something I knew I would never achieve." It was a moment of rare vulnerability, and Eve found herself touched by that confession. Carter wasn't just the relentless magnate he appeared to be. There was a wounded boy in him who had given up on his own dreams to meet the expectations of a father who never truly cared about his happiness. "It's never too late to start over," she said softly. "Do you really believe that?" "I believe people can change if they really want to." Carter extended his hand across the table and lightly touched hers. Eve didn't pull away, though she felt an electric current run up her arm. "And you, Eve? What would you like to do if you could choose anything?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever been interested in her dreams, in her deepest desires. "I'd like to have a library," she said, surprising herself with the honesty of the answer. "A place full of books, where people like me could come to read, learn, dream. A place where stories weren't a luxury but a necessity." Carter smiled, and for the first time since they had met, it was a genuine smile, without calculations or ulterior motives. "A library," he repeated. "It's a beautiful dream. It's an impossible dream." "Why impossible?" Eve withdrew her hand from under his, reality returning like a slap. "Because people like me don't have libraries. People like me clean other people's libraries." "You're no longer a person who cleans libraries," said Carter, with a firmness that surprised her. You're an intelligent, capable woman who deserves to have all her dreams fulfilled." There was something in the way he said this that made Eve's heart race. It wasn't the voice of the man who had blackmailed her to be there. It was the voice of someone who really believed what he was saying. This new dynamic between them began to affect Eve in ways she hadn't expected. She began to dream about Carter, disturbing dreams where he appeared sometimes as protector, sometimes as lover. She would wake with her heart racing and a physical need she tried to ignore but which grew each day. Carter, for his part, was discovering that the slow conquest was much more addictive than he had imagined. Each genuine smile he managed to draw from Eve, each moment when she lowered her guard was like a precious victory. He began to care more about her well-being than his own desires. One night, working late at the office, Eve fell asleep over some reports. Carter found her like this, with her serene face resting on her arms, her brown hair falling like a curtain over the documents. He contemplated her for long minutes, feeling a tenderness he hadn't experienced since childhood. He took his jacket and placed it gently over her shoulders. Eve awoke at the touch, and for a few seconds their eyes met in an intimacy neither of them expected. "You should go home," he said softly. "I was almost finishing," she murmured, still sleepy. "Eve," said Carter, bending down until he was at her level, "you don't need to prove yourself to me. You don't need to work to exhaustion to deserve being here." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. "Then why am I here, Carter?" "Really?" It was a dangerous question, exposing the vulnerability of both. Carter knew that the honest answer might frighten Eve, but he also knew that the moment of truth had arrived. "Because I need you," he said, with devastating simplicity. "Not as a trophy, not as a conquest. I need you like I've never needed anyone." Eve felt the words resonate in her chest like bells. There was a raw truth there that went beyond obsession, beyond physical desire. There was a genuine need, a thirst for connection that mirrored her own loneliness. "Carter," she whispered, and there was something different in her voice. He moved closer, their faces inches apart. Eve could feel his warm breath, see the small lines around his eyes, the almost imperceptible scar in the corner of his mouth. For the first time, he didn't seem to her a powerful and unreachable man, but just a wounded human being seeking connection. "Eve," he murmured, his lips almost touching hers. And then, in an impulse that surprised them both, she closed the distance between them and kissed him. The kiss burned between them like liquid fire, laden with weeks of repressed tension and years of unconfessed loneliness. Eve gave herself to that moment with an intensity that frightened her, feeling as if she were finally awakening from a deep sleep. Carter kissed her with an almost religious reverence, as if she were something sacred that he feared breaking with too much pressure. When they separated, both were breathing heavily. Eve saw in his eyes a vulnerability she had never witnessed, as if he had removed all masks and shown himself completely naked before her. "Eve," he whispered, touching her face with trembling fingers. "You can't imagine how long I've waited for this." She knew she should pull away, that kiss had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. But there was something magnetic about Carter in that moment, a need that mirrored her own craving for genuine affection. "We need to talk," she said, trying to regain some control over the situation. "Not now," he replied, kissing her forehead with infinite tenderness. "Now I just want to take you home and take care of you." It was a simple promise, but laden with meanings that Eve was still processing. She let him accompany her to the apartment, where he prepared tea while she changed into more comfortable clothes. There was something domestic about that scene that contrasted with the intensity of the moment in the office. "Carter," she said when they sat on the living room sofa, "I need to tell you something about me, about my family." He looked at her with total attention, as if every word she uttered was precious. "My mother's name was Lucy Norton," Eve began, carefully observing his reaction. "She worked as a maid in a country house in the 90s. Carter frowned, as if some distant memory was touched by those words. "She had an affair with her employer," continued Eve, her voice gaining strength. "A married man, rich, who promised to leave his wife for her. But when the wife found out, everything fell apart." Carter's face gradually paled, as if the pieces of a terrible puzzle were beginning to fit together in his mind. "The wife killed herself," said Eve, observing how he instinctively recoiled. "And my mother died shortly after of heartbreak and shame. I went to a foster home at 5 years old." "No. whispered Carter, getting up abruptly. "It can't be." "Your mother's name was Claire Whitman," said Eve with cruel gentleness. "She drowned in the pool at the country house after discovering the affair between my father and my mother." Carter began pacing around the room like a caged animal, running his hands through his hair in a desperate gesture. "This isn't possible," he repeated. "This can't be happening." "That's why you felt attracted to me from the beginning," continued Eve, standing up to face him. "Some part of you recognized something in me, the same blood that destroyed your mother." Carter stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression that mixed horror and fascination. "You knew," he said, and it wasn't a question. "So you knew from the beginning?" "I found out recently," admitted Eve. "Nathan investigated your family and found the connection." The mention of Nathan made something dark pass through Carter's eyes. "Where is he now?" he asked, with a coldness that made Eve shiver. "Dying," she replied simply. "His disease has progressed. He has a few months to live." The answer completely disarmed Carter. He had prepared to combat a rival, not to face mortality. "Why did you tell me this?" he finally asked. "Because I deserve to choose," said Eve, approaching him despite the fear she felt. "I deserve to know the truth about why I'm here, about what really exists between us." Carter looked at her with an intensity that seemed to want to decipher her soul. "And now that you know the truth, what will you do?" Eve breathed deeply, gathering courage for the answer that would change everything. "I'm going to stay," she said. "Not because you blackmailed me, not because I have no choice. I'm going to stay because I choose to break this cycle of destruction. Our fathers caused death and suffering. We can choose something different." It was a brave and transformative declaration. Carter studied her for long moments, as if trying to understand how that fragile woman had become so strong. "You don't fear me?" he asked. "I do," admitted Eve, "but I also desire you. And I think for the first time in my life I want to take a risk." The brutal honesty of the confession hit Carter like lightning. Throughout his life he had been desired for his power, his money, his influence. But Eve desired him despite all this, knowing his deepest demons. "Eve," he said, approaching cautiously, "if we stay together, it won't be easy. I have scars that may never completely heal." "So do I," she replied, touching his face with delicacy. "But maybe we can heal together." They kissed again, but this time it was different. There were no more secrets between them, no more power games. It was just a wounded man and woman choosing to try to build something new upon the ruins of the past. Carter took her to the bedroom, but his hands trembled when he began to undress her blouse. Eve noticed his hesitation. "What is it?" she asked. "You're a virgin," he said, as if that word carried a sacred weight. "And I don't want to be like my father. I don't want to hurt you like he hurt your mother." The vulnerability in his voice touched Eve deeply. She realized that Carter carried an ancestral guilt, as if he were responsible for his father's sins. "You are not your father," she said firmly, "and I am not my mother. We are two adults making a conscious choice. But what if I hurt you? What if I can't love you the way you deserve?" Eve smiled, and there was an ancient wisdom in her eyes. "Then at least we will have tried. At least we will have chosen love instead of fear." Carter kissed her with a desperate passion, as if he wanted to absorb her strength and courage. When they made love for the first time, it was with an intensity that transcended the physical. It was as if they were sealing a pact, promising a future different from the past that had shaped them. Afterwards, lying in the darkness of the bedroom, Eve traced circles on Carter's chest with her fingers. "I don't regret it," she said softly. "Neither do I," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "But I'm afraid of what comes next." "Why?" "Because now you have power over me, power to completely destroy me." Eve propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. "And you have the same power over me," she said. "The difference is that we choose not to use it." It was a simple but revolutionary truth. For the first time in their lives, both had found someone with whom they could be completely vulnerable, without fearing destruction. Outside, Chicago continued its frenzied dance of dreams and nightmares, but inside that room, two wounded souls had found a peace that neither had imagined possible. The months that followed were like living in a dangerous dream. Eve and Carter built an intimate routine that blended work and passion in an almost surreal way. During the day, they maintained a professional facade at the office, but at night they gave themselves to each other with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Carter discovered in Eve an intellectual companion who challenged his ideas and softened his sharpest edges. Eve, in turn, saw Carter slowly abandon the armor of coldness he had worn for decades, but not everything was perfect in the paradise they had built. Carter still carried deep scars that manifested in moments of extreme possessiveness. When Eve talked too long with other men at social events, he became tense and controlling. When she mentioned wanting to visit Nathan, who was withering in a public hospital, Carter reacted with a jealousy that surprised them both. "He's dying, Carter," said Eve in one of these discussions, her voice laden with frustration. "It's the most innocent thing in the world to want to say goodbye to him." "It's not about innocence," replied Carter, nervously pacing around his apartment. "It's about the fact that that man loves you, and a part of you still loves him too." Eve looked at him with a mixture of anger and compassion. She knew that insecurity too well. It was the same fear of abandonment that she herself carried. "Carter, you need to trust me. You need to trust what we have." "I try," he said, stopping to face her. "But every time I think of you in another man's arms, something in me breaks." It was a raw confession, revealing the depth of his emotional dependence. Eve approached him, touching his face gently. "I chose you," she said. "I chose to stay, chose to try to build something real with us. But if you can't trust in that, we'll destroy everything we've created." The conversation ended with Carter reluctantly agreeing that she could visit Nathan, but Eve knew that possessiveness was just the tip of the iceberg. Carter had grown up in a family where love was synonymous with betrayal and abandonment. Learning to trust would be a long and painful process. The visit to the hospital was devastating. Nathan had lost weight drastically. His skin had acquired a ghostly pallor, and his movements were slow and careful. But his eyes still shone with the same kindness that had won Eve over months ago. "You're happy," he said when she sat beside his bed. "I can see it in your face." Eve held his hand, feeling how cold and fragile it was. "I'm trying to be," she answered honestly. "And him? Is he treating you well?" "He's learning," said Eve. "Some days are better than others." Nathan smiled, and there was a melancholy wisdom in his expression. "Love is never easy, Eve, especially between people who have been hurt like you two. But sometimes it's worth fighting for." They talked for hours about books, memories, hopes for a future that Nathan wouldn't see. When Eve prepared to leave, he held her hand with more strength than she expected. "Eve, there's something I need to give you," he said, taking an envelope from the drawer beside the bed. "I found this among my mother's belongings after her death. She worked at the Whitman house for a few years before the scandal." Eve opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was an old cassette tape and a handwritten letter. "It's a recording your mother made before she died," explained Nathan, "and a letter she wrote but never sent. I think you need to hear this." Eve put the envelope in her purse, her heart racing with the possibilities of what she might discover. She said goodbye to Nathan with a kiss on his forehead, both knowing it was probably the last time they would see each other. Back at the apartment, Eve spent hours looking at the envelope without the courage to open it. When Carter arrived from work, he found her sitting on the sofa, pale and tense. "What happened?" he asked, sitting beside her. Eve told him about the visit to Nathan and about what she had received. Carter tensed when he heard about the recording. "Do you want me to stay while you listen?" he asked. Eve nodded, needing his strength to face the ghosts of the past. They put the tape in an old player that Carter had specially sent for the occasion. When Lucy Norton's voice began to speak, both felt a shiver run down their spines. "My name is Lucy Norton, and if anyone is listening to this, I'm probably already dead," said the young, frightened voice. "I need to tell the truth about what happened at the Whitman house, about Claire, about Arthur, about everything." The recording revealed a much more complex story than they had imagined. Lucy hadn't just been an opportunistic lover. She and Claire Whitman had become friends, two lonely women in a big, cold house. Arthur Whitman was a violent and controlling man who emotionally abused his wife and any employee he considered attractive. "Claire discovered that Arthur was forcing me to accept his advances," continued the voice on the recording. "She wanted to protect me, offered me money to run away. But he discovered our plans." The story that unfolded was of two women trying to protect each other from a powerful and cruel man. Arthur had threatened to fire Lucy and destroy her reputation if she tried to leave. Claire, in desperation, had tried to confront her husband. "They fought that night," said Lucy, her voice broken by sobs. "I heard screams, sounds of struggle. When I went down to see what was happening, I found Claire floating in the pool. Arthur was standing at the edge, saying she had tripped and fallen." Eve felt her blood freeze in her veins. Beside her, Carter had completely paled. "It wasn't suicide," he whispered. "My father killed my mother." The recording continued, revealing how Arthur had pressured Lucy to keep silent, threatening not only her, but also her small daughter. Lucy had fled the city, but the weight of guilt and fear consumed her until death. When the tape ended, Eve and Carter remained silent for long minutes, processing the magnitude of what they had discovered. The letter that accompanied the recording was an apology from Lucy to Claire, a prayer for forgiveness that had never been sent. "My God," murmured Carter, burying his face in his hands. "All these years blaming my mother for weakness, when in fact she was murdered." Eve hugged him, feeling his pain as if it were her own. Both had grown up carrying guilt that wasn't theirs, wounds caused by a man who had destroyed everything he touched. "We have to expose this," said Eve. "Your mother deserves justice, even after all these years." Carter looked at her with eyes red from unshed tears. "My father has been dead for 5 years," he said. "There's nothing more we can do to him." "But we can clear our mother's names," insisted Eve. "We can tell the truth." Carter nodded slowly, understanding that this was the key to definitely break the chains of the past. For the first time since childhood, he cried, bitter tears for a mother who had been wronged, for a life built on lies, for all the time lost blaming the victims instead of the true villain. Eve held him as he cried, knowing that those tears were the first step towards true healing. They finally knew the complete truth, and that truth, however painful it might be, would free them from the shadows that had pursued their families for decades. The Whitman family's country house had remained closed for more than 2 decades, like a mausoleum of memories that no one wanted to revisit. When Eve and Carter arrived there on a cold winter morning, they found a place haunted by time and abandonment. The pool where Claire had died was empty and covered with dry leaves, like a wound that had never healed. Carter walked through the rooms with hesitant steps, touching furniture covered by white sheets, as if they were ghosts of a past he could finally confront. Eve followed him in silence, respecting that moment of reconciliation with his own history. "This is where she liked to read," said Carter, stopping on a veranda that overlooked an overgrown garden. "My mother would spend hours in this chair, with a book in her lap and her eyes lost on the horizon." Eve approached him, intertwining her fingers with his. 2 weeks had passed since they heard her mother's recording, and both were still processing the devastating revelations about Arthur Whitman. "She would have liked you," said Carter softly. "My mother always believed people could be redeemed, even when all signs pointed to the contrary." "And your mother would have liked to know that you finally discovered the truth about her," replied Eve. They had come to the country house with a specific mission. Nathan had mentioned that there might be more evidence hidden there, documents or objects that Arthur had left behind in his haste to cover up the crime. But as they explored the rooms, Carter realized it wasn't just about seeking proof. It was about making peace with a place that had haunted his nightmares for years. In Arthur's study, they found an unexpected surprise. Behind a bookshelf of dusty books, there was a small safe that Carter had completely forgotten. Inside, besides old financial documents, they found a diary that Arthur had kept in the months before Claire's death. The pages revealed the disturbed mind of a man who saw all women as property to be controlled. Arthur wrote about Lucy with a sick obsession, and about Claire with a contempt that made Carter's stomach turn. There were passages that confirmed Lucy's version on the recording, including an entry dated the day of Claire's death. "She threatened to leave me today," said one of the entries. "Said she would take evidence to the police about what I do with the maids. As if any policeman would believe a hysterical woman against me. I had to take drastic action." It was an almost explicit confession, more than enough to definitively clear Claire Whitman's name. Carter closed the diary with trembling hands, feeling as if he had just exorcised a demon he had carried for decades. "It's over," said Eve, hugging him from behind. "It's finally over." They burned the diary right there in the study's fireplace, watching as Arthur's poisonous words transformed into ashes. It was a cathartic ritual, a way to symbolically destroy the power that man had exercised over their lives, even after death. When they left the country house that afternoon, both felt they had left behind more than just a physical place. They had abandoned the versions of themselves that were defined by the pain and guilt of the past. 3 months later, Eve was organizing the final details of the community library that Carter had financed in her honor. It was a bright and welcoming space in Chicago's South Side, where low-income children and adults could have free access to thousands of books. The dream that Eve had timidly mentioned that night at the restaurant had become reality in a way she had never imagined possible. Lucy and Claire Library, Eve read aloud, looking at the plaque that would be inaugurated the following week. "Are you sure about the name?" Carter smiled, wrapping his arm around her waist. "I'm sure. Our mothers deserve to be remembered for something beautiful, not just for the tragedy." The library was more than a philanthropic project. It was the materialization of the transformation they had both undergone. Carter had discovered that using his power and wealth to create something meaningful was much more rewarding than simply accumulating more money. Eve, for her part, had found a way to honor her passion for literature while helping people who, like her, had grown up without access to quality education. The inauguration ceremony was simple but moving. Present were children from the neighborhood, teachers, community activists, and some Whitman Developments employees who had been surprised by the change in their president. Carter gave a brief but touching speech about second chances and how love could transform even the hardest hearts. Eve, who had overcome her aversion to public speaking, told her own story of overcoming, of how an orphaned girl had discovered in books a way to dream of a better future. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. After the ceremony, when the last guests had departed, Eve and Carter walked hand in hand through the empty shelves that would soon be filled with stories waiting to be discovered. "You know what's most amazing about all this?" said Eve, stopping to admire the space she had helped create. "What?" asked Carter, kissing her temple. "A year ago, I was cleaning offices, and you were destroying lives to get what you wanted. Today, we're here creating something that will last for generations." Carter turned her to face him, his eyes shining with an emotion she had learned to recognize as pure and non-possessive love. "Eve Norton," he said, his voice laden with meaning, "you haven't just transformed my life. You taught me that I could be a different man from my father. And you taught me that I deserve to be loved," she replied, touching his face tenderly. "Truly loved, not just tolerated or spared." They kissed there, among the empty shelves that would soon be full of dreams and possibilities. It was a kiss that sealed not just their love, but also the promise of a future, built on solid foundations of mutual trust and shared purpose. 6 months later, Nathan died peacefully in the hospital, surrounded by Eve, Carter, and some professors from the university where he had studied. His last words were for Eve. "Thank you for showing me that it was worth having hope." The funeral was small but meaningful. Carter, who had learned to admire the man he had once seen as a rival, insisted on paying all expenses and organizing a worthy tribute. It was his way of honoring someone who had loved Eve with generosity and selflessness, qualities he himself was learning to cultivate. A year after the library's inauguration, Eve and Carter married in a simple ceremony on the veranda of the old country house, which they had renovated and transformed into a refuge full of light and life. The place where Claire had died now celebrated the birth of something new and beautiful. Eve wore a simple but elegant dress and carried a bouquet of daisies, the same flowers that Nathan used to bring her. Carter had abandoned the somber suits that characterized his old persona, opting for a lighter outfit that reflected the renewed man he had become. When they exchanged the vows they had written personally, they spoke about second chances, about the courage to love despite fear, about building a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. "Eve," said Carter, holding her hands as tears ran down his face, "you taught me that true love isn't about possessing, but about liberating. So I promise to love you with freedom, to protect you with gentleness, and to build with you a life that is worthy of the sacrifices of all who came before us." "Carter," replied Eve, her voice firm despite the emotion, "you showed me that I deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be loved. I promise to stand by your side in victories and storms, not as your property, but as your equal partner in all things." When they kissed as husband and wife, the late afternoon sun painted the sky golden, as if the universe itself was celebrating that unlikely union that had been born from the ashes of tragedy and blossomed in true love. Years later, when they told their story to the children who came to bless their marriage, Eve and Carter always emphasized a fundamental lesson, that even the most wounded people can choose healing, that even the darkest pasts can generate luminous futures, and that true love isn't about perfection, but about two imperfect people choosing to grow together every day.